Hello everyone and welcome to Old Timey Comics. We head back into the past of superhero comics to check out all the good, the bad, and the absolutely ridiculous. All alterations to the panels, text, and images are to prevent copyright problems, and all art is owned by its respective companies. We head today to March of 1963 as Peter Parker returns in the first issue of Amazing Spider-Man. This issue we get two stories for the price of one as Spider-Man contends with everything from the Chameleon to the Fantastic Four to Jolly J. Jonah Jameson. We pick up right at the end of Amazing Fantasy number 15. Peter has just helped the police catch Uncle Ben's killer and is already wishing he had never become Spider-Man in the first place. Without Ben around, Aunt May is already struggling to make ends meet and pay the rent. How long has it been since Ben's death? Did he and May not have any kind of emergency funds or life insurance set up in case something like this happened? Peter tries to think of ways he could help and considers the fact that just about any crime would be a breeze with his spider powers. That thought is short-lived though, as Peter knows it would break Aunt May's heart, so instead he decides it's best to go back into show business. Even though they had no problem paying him in his last appearance, the producer tells Peter that he can't pay him in cash because they need records for taxes, so instead they make a check out to Spider-Man. The problem is, Peter doesn't have any documents to identify himself as Spider-Man, so he can't actually cash the check. Peter just kind of accepts this and walks away instead of going back and demanding his producer fix this. After all, it's completely legal to get paid in cash as long as the necessary taxes are deducted from it. The whole tax record excuse is rubbish. And if they don't fix it, Spider-Man could always sue, then Aunt May really wouldn't have to worry about money for a while. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Daily Bugle editor J. Jonah Jameson sits in his office writing an article. The effects are seen the very next night as the article declaring Spider-Man as a public menace has caused the show to be cancelled for fear of backlash. At this point, Peter should just sue for libel, as Jameson has single-handedly destroyed Spider-Man's good name and livelihood. Honestly, a lot of his issues could be solved with a good lawyer behind him. Jameson isn't satisfied with just accusatory newspaper articles, though. He also travels around giving talks about how much of a danger Spider-Man is. After all, kids might attempt to replicate his fantastic feats. What kind of argument is that? Why don't we just outlaw the circus? Don't want all the kiddies to break their necks trying to imitate acrobats. Instead, kids need to respect real heroes like Jameson's son, test pilot John Jameson. So if I've got this right, the truth is that JJJ is just jealous that Spider-Man is getting more attention than his own son. And that smells like a conflict of interest, which would just be more evidence for that libel case. Life continues to hate on Peter Parker as he struggles to find a part-time job because for some reason nobody wants to hire a kid that's still in high school. We also overhear a paperboy for the Daily Bugle announcing the new headline story as John Jameson prepares to orbit the Earth. So, first defame Spider-Man and then immediately run a piece about how great his son is. Conflict of interest. Problems continue as Peter, whose face currently looks like it came out of a Where's Waldo book, happens to see Aunt May pawning off her jewelry in order to make ends meet, and Pete lashes out in frustration at his helplessness. But even with all that, and John Jameson being indirectly responsible for Peter's Spider-Man problems, Pete still shows up to watch the launch the next day. Everything is going fine with the launch as the final capsule is released, but suddenly part of the ship's forward guidance pack breaks loose, sending the capsule careening out of control. Just a quick note about space travel, or at least orbits. One object will orbit another when its horizontal momentum balances out with the force of gravity acting on it. Too fast and the object goes flying off into space, but too slow and the object gets dragged back to Earth. What I'm trying to say is, if the capsule is released at the right height and speed, its orbit should already be set. No need for a guidance system or anything at this point. The launch team does make an attempt to rescue the capsule by dropping a net in front of it, but unfortunately they miss. Even more interesting to me is the fact that in order to even attempt to drop the net on the capsule, they would need something that could both fly higher and faster than Jameson's pod. So why isn't it the one doing the orbit instead? And when did they have time to launch it? Apparently, the audience on the ground can also tell what's going on as Peter retrieves his costume from where he hid it, declaring that only Spider-Man can save John Jameson now. Sure. Good luck with that, webhead. Spider-Man swings his way over to the control room and, despite Jameson's protests, manages to convince the commander to give him a spare control unit. After all, what's the worst that could happen at this point? He runs over to a nearby airfield and webs up the guard that tries to stop him and then has to commandeer a plane and pilot in order to catch up to the still falling capsule. I guess the control room couldn't be bothered to radio ahead that Spidey was coming. Once they're lined up with the capsule, Spider-Man manages to make a 1 in a million web sling to latch onto the pod, and somehow both he and his web hold out long enough to climb aboard and attach the new guidance module. This finally brings the pod back under John's control and allows him to deploy the parachute. Wait. So your guidance module on the outside of the ship, one little part, is responsible for all the various controls inside the capsule? What about redundant systems? Or a way for mission control to force certain systems to activate? Or any automatic safety systems to go off if something fails? Just who in their right mind designed this horrible death trap? Either way, the capsule lands safely and Peter's feeling pretty proud of himself. Unfortunately, Jameson doesn't feel the same way as the Daily Bugle calls for Spider-Man's arrest and prosecution. Jameson insists that Spider-Man sabotaged the rocket himself so that he could swoop in, save the day, and take all the credit. Can Jameson just make baseless claims like that if an investigation hasn't turned up any evidence of sabotage? Is nobody else reporting the truth on this? Surely the Bugle isn't the only paper or news outlet in the city, and between its conflict of interest and lack of credibility, it's pretty despicable. And yet, even though all that's true, the public still eats it up. Heck, Jameson even manages to pressure the FBI into putting Spider-Man on their most wanted list. What kind of dirt does Jonah have on the freaking Federal Bureau of Investigation that they bend to the whims of one overly angry newspaper editor? Our first story wraps up as everyone, even Aunt May, has fallen in line with Jameson's drivel bashing Peter's alter ego. Let's jump right into the second story with Peter Palmer. No, seriously, his name gets mixed up all issue. Whoops! Oh, and he also has no eyes, so that's fun. Anyway, still needing some source of income, he decides that as Spider-Man, he'll go work for the Fantastic Four. What could go wrong? So Peter heads over to the Baxter building and tries the elevator, just to remember that it can only be operated by the Fantastic Four by some sort of special electronic beam. Rather than try to get a hold of them, Peter decides to pry open the elevator doors and try to climb up the shaft. Unfortunately, his brilliant plan is stopped as the elevator turns out to be above him. I mean, duh. I don't know how the Baxter building works, but I presume the lobby's on the first floor, so the elevator would either have to be there or on an upper floor. Unless it has a basement. No comment. Not knowing when to give up, Peter heads to the roof of a nearby building and changes into a Spider-Man costume before slinging a web tightrope onto the Baxter building. Nothing says successful job interview like breaking and entering. Well, unless you're interviewing for lockpicking, but that's beside the point. As he makes his way up, an alarm goes off alerting the Fantastic Four to Spider-Man's presence. As Spidey swings into the conveniently open window, the team drops a plexiglass cage down on him, but Peter forces it open before it can fully close. So why does the plexiglass only close after it comes down, leaving an open escape route for the webhead? Now that Spider-Man's free to run around, he has to take on the entire Fantastic Four all at once. He throws Ben into Johnny and tosses a quick web net over Mr. Fantastic. This leaves Sue to try and sneak up on Spidey with a still visible lasso, which isn't exactly hard to notice. Reed's had enough and puffs himself up like a giant goofy rubber balloon and finally gets Spider-Man to tell him why he's here. Once Spidey finishes telling the Fantastic Four his dilemma, they drop the bomb on him that they're a non-profit organization, so they couldn't actually pay him. And isn't he wanted by the police anyway? Not that they'll bother to stop him and turn him in as he leaves in a huff. We skip over now to the Chameleon in his dreaded multi-pocket disguise vest as he sneaks through a defensive installation out on the edge of town, switching disguises as necessary to leave nobody at the station aware of his presence. Back at the Chameleon's dressing room hideout of Doom, the news is reporting on Spider-Man's earlier encounter with the Fantastic Four. Chameleon somehow pieces together that Spider-Man must have gone to them because he needed money. I mean, he's right, but I don't understand how he got to that conclusion. But either way, this gives him an idea of how he can make Spider-Man the fall guy for his next caper. Figuring Spider-Man has the relative powers and instincts of a spider, Chameleon sends out a message that only he'll be able to receive. How would he even happen to know what that wavelength is? And are we also suggesting that spiders are miniature radio transceivers like the ants in Ant-Man are treated? They're not, but that does seem to be where this comic is headed. Peter receives the message and leaves his clothes on a nearby rooftop before he heads off to meet this new contact. After all, what's the worst that could happen, going to meet a random person you don't know that contacts you through a message only you can hear promising you money? It's not like it could be a trap as that person changes into their own copy of your costume to impersonate you. Actually, did the Chameleon already have a Spider-Man costume just laying around? If not, he must secretly have seamster-based superpowers. And yes, seamster is the male version of seamstress, as in someone who sews clothes versus a tailor who can be male or female that specializes in altering already made clothing to fit better. But I suppose we're getting off topic again. Chameleon as Spider-Man goes into action stealing defensive plans and tries to make it more convincing by restraining the guards he runs into with some sort of web gun. Okay, I was willing to let the costume slide, but you're telling me he already had a gun that shoots a web-like substance lying around just in case? The villain escapes up to the roof in his waiting helicopter, taking off just as Spider-Man arrives on the scene to be confronted by the guards. Nobody heard the helicopter taking off? Or what about landing when the Chameleon originally arrived? Those things aren't exactly quiet. Peter pieces together the situation and webs up the guards in order to buy himself some time before using his spider sense to tune in to the fleeing helicopter and track it. Spider-Man gets creative with his web slinging, first using a web slingshot and then a web parachute to travel across the city as only a spider can. though I can't speak for how well that parachute should work given that it has so many holes in it, as the point of a parachute is to be one solid shape to catch as much air as possible. Spidey, borrows a motorboat as he continues to pursue the Chameleon's helicopter as it flies out to meet with the Soviet submarine. Before Chameleon can hand over the defense plan, Spider-Man webs the submarine's hatch shut, which then retreats since they've been seen. As Spidey grabs onto the bottom of the helicopter, the Chameleon puts it through some rather impressive and impossible evasive maneuvers, but still can't shake off Spider-Man. The Chameleon is forced to land as Spider-Man brings him out to face the guards. The victory is short-lived though, as one smoke bomb later, the Chameleon manages to take back the defensive plans and make his escape before quickly switching into a guard's uniform. When Spider-Man and the guards arrive, none of them bother to notice that there's 3 guards now instead of 2. I can let Spider-Man pass, but shouldn't the guards have a bit more awareness than that? Before Spidey can figure everything out, the Chameleon hits the lights. Peter can still sense him with his spider sense, but he's all out of web fluid. I guess that's what happens when you use it all to make impossible parachutes. While the other guards get the lights, Spider-Man tackles the Chameleon. However, even though the guards came down with Spider-Man, they believe the mysterious third guard when he tells them that Spider-Man is actually the Chameleon in disguise. Yeah, they're not exactly the brightest bulbs in the pack. Luckily, though, part of the Chameleon's uniform is torn in the struggle, finally revealing the truth to our gullible guards. Unfortunately, they can't apologize or thank Spider-Man for his efforts, as Peter has already run off crying into the night. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to show your support, or check out Old Timey Comics on Patreon to truly help the show to grow. Have a character or story you'd like to see covered in an episode? Let me know in the comments. If you want to read the story for yourself, you can do so through a subscription to Marvel Unlimited or by purchasing it digitally. Stay tuned for the next episode of Old Timey Comics.